Chapter 1. Is there life after death? Where will you go when you die? Will you find yourself in paradise surrounded by love, joy, and peace? Or will you pass from life into a place of torment, regret, and never-ending sorrow? Some say you'll simply cease to exist, returning to the nothingness you knew, or rather didn't know, before you were born. There is no more important question to ask than, what will happen to me when I die? After all, no matter how young or healthy you may be, you're going to die someday. We all will. And no matter how many years a person might live, it is a very short time compared to eternity. Obviously, we should all do everything we possibly can to prepare for what lies ahead. If there is something we can do to ensure a happy afterlife, then by all means, we ought to do it. Will Rogers once said that the only two things certain in life are death and taxes. If you know all the loopholes and have a smart attorney, you may get out of paying taxes, but nobody, and I do mean nobody, can cheat death. Death is inescapable. One of my favorite comic writers is Woody Allen. He is obsessed with death and dying and turns his insecurity into an art form with his on-screen characters. He was once quoted as saying, "I don't want to achieve immortality through my work, I want to achieve it through not dying." Sorry, Woody, that's not going to happen. Every human being who has ever lived before us has died, with two possible exceptions according to the Bible: Enoch in Genesis 5:24 and Elijah 2 Kings 2:11. Based on what we've seen so far, we can pretty much assume that death is going to come for each of us. A few years ago, the U.S. government spent billions of dollars to bail out several big banks and two of the big three automakers. The rationale for this huge expense was that these businesses were, quote, too big to fail. In other words, the feeling was that their failure would have such a huge negative impact on the American economy that it just couldn't be allowed. And yet no human being is too big to die. Kings and presidents die. Brilliant physicists and philosophers die. Beautiful actresses and rock stars die. Superhuman athletes and great leaders die. Everyone dies. Death is the great equalizer. Rich, poor, black, white, male, female, tall, short, beautiful, ugly, everyone is equal in the grave. I'm sure you've been touched by death in one way or another. We all have. Most of us have lost parents, friends, or other loved ones. We may wonder where they are. Are they happy? Do they have an awareness of what's going on in our lives? Are they proud of us when we succeed? Do they weep with us in our moments of sorrow and loss? We are also aware of political leaders, sports heroes, and celebrities who have died. They may have been people we looked up to and admired. Elvis Presley and John Lennon are dead. So are Marilyn Monroe, Nelson Mandela, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. They seemed bigger than life. Then they were gone. Again, nobody is exempt. We are all going to die. And after death, where do we go? Why I'm writing this book. My purpose in writing this book is to try to fill in the blanks by exploring what the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, has to say on the subject. We'll explore the ancient Jewish concepts of heaven and hell and look at what Jews believe today. How does this differ from the historic Christian view? And finally, I will share the experiences of 6 out of more than a dozen people I interviewed over a 1-year period from all different backgrounds who claim to have traveled beyond the veil and visited heaven or hell. Most of the 6 billion people in the world today believe that life continues after death. Human beings have always had an intuitive feeling that there must be something more than this life. As Dinesh D'Souza writes in his book, Life After Death, across the cultures of the world, both East and West, and right through the long march of history, people have affirmed that this life is one chapter in a larger story of existence, and that there is life after death. Many of the world's greatest scientists and philosophers, from John Locke to Isaac Newton, affirmed their belief in the afterlife. Even skeptical Enlightenment figures like Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin professed similar views. Europe is the only continent where a bare majority of people believe in the afterlife. By contrast, nearly 80% of Americans today affirm life after death, and the percentage is even higher, in fact close to 100% in non-Western cultures. Close quote. Most of us continue to believe in life after death, despite many scientists' attempt to convince us that we are nothing more than the evolution of slime over millions of years. Their belief has been that everything we do, say, and think is controlled by our brains. When our brains die, they say, everything that makes us who we are dies with them. But most of us know instinctively that this is not the case. If we are merely machines controlled by our brains, then where did our emotions come from? How did we learn to love our parents, our spouses, our children, and our friends? How did we come to understand the difference between right and wrong, and why do we get a guilty conscience when we do something we know we shouldn't do? Who or what told us we shouldn't do it? In his classic Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis writes about what he calls the law of human nature, or the moral law. He says, "Whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in real right and wrong, you will find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he will complain, 'It's not fair,' before you can say Jack Robinson. A nation may say treaties do not matter, but then, next minute, they spoil their case by saying the particular treaty they want to break is an unfair one. It seems, then, we are forced to believe in a real right and wrong." Close quote. Lewis is making an extremely strong case for the existence of a grand design and a grand designer behind the universe. As he points out, all of the world's various cultures see right and wrong in much the same way. He says, think of a country where men were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 make 5. Selfishness has never been admired. Men have differed as to whether you ought to have 1 wife or 4, but they have always agreed that you must not simply have any woman you liked. Close quote. Lewis also presents a compelling argument against those who say that humans engage in right behavior because of ingrained instinct. If 2 instincts are in conflict, and there is nothing in a creature's mind except those 2 instincts, obviously the stronger of the 2 must win. But at those moments when we are most conscious of the moral law, it seems to be telling us to side with the weaker of the 2 impulses. You probably want to be safe, much more than you want to help the man who is drowning, but the moral law tells you to help him all the same. The moral law is not any one instinct or any set of instincts. It is something which makes a kind of tune, the tune which we call goodness or right conduct, by directing the instincts. This is where I personally have one of my biggest philosophical problems with the theory of evolution. It's one thing to believe that over billions of years our bodies evolved from tiny one-celled organisms into human beings with trillions of cells doing highly specialized tasks. Frankly, it boggles the mind to think that this could happen by chance, without a master plan or a creative force behind it. As well, evolution fails to explain how life could form from non-life. But what is perhaps most difficult for me to imagine is that one day the switch suddenly turned on and living creatures began to think. Physical changes are one thing. The ability to think and reason is an entirely other matter. René Descartes called this dualism. He famously said, "I think, therefore I am." In other words, we do more than observe and accept the things we see at face value. We analyze, we probe. We are even capable of doubting what we see and of exercising free will. Philosopher John Locke, in Book 4 of the Essay, imagines what would happen if, one night while they were sleeping, a prince and a cobbler suddenly exchanged consciousness. When they woke up the next morning, would they be the men they were when they first went to sleep? The answer is yes, they would. They would have the same bodies they had before, But would they be the same person? No, because each would now have the memories and consciousness of the other. Personal identity, Locke argues, is not the same as having the same physical substance. There is something more that makes us who we truly are. Dinesh D'Souza writes, without free will, even collective decisions become involuntary. If there is no free will, the American founders didn't choose to adopt a constitution in Philadelphia, nor did Americans elect Barack Obama president. Nor is there anything we can decide to do to improve Social Security or Medicare. If free will is an illusion, then there are no good deeds or bad deeds because no one has any choice in the matter. Close quote. D'Souza points to Immanuel Kant, who argued in his book Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone that mortality is an indispensable part of being human. D'Souza writes, no human culture has existed without morality. In fact, no normal human being can altogether reject morality. People who are unable to distinguish right from wrong are considered psychopaths. Treat any materialist with inhumane brutality, not as a person, but as an object, and he will indignantly protest, "You shouldn't have done that." Try as he might, the materialist cannot completely get away from morality. Morality is an incontrovertible fact in the world, no less real than any other fact. D'Souza continues, we have now found two central features of human nature, consciousness and free will, that are irreducible to matter and appear to be independent from it. Even more remarkable, consciousness and free will have no natural explanation and seem to function beyond the bounds of physical law. Things that are defined by physical laws, such as human bodies and human brains, are perishable or destructible. Consciousness and free will, unbound by those constraints, are not. Moreover, consciousness and free will are the defining features of the human soul, which requires awareness and choices in order to discriminate between right and wrong. The implication is that whatever happens to our bodies and brains after death, our souls live on. Politically incorrect? While belief in life after death is positive, and I believe part of the divine programming instilled in all humans, I am concerned by the growing perception that death is followed by eternal paradise no matter what we may have believed or how we have behaved in this life. This and the idea that, quote, all roads lead to the same destination is a dangerous conviction. I fear for the thousands of people who pass into eternity every day completely unprepared for what may lie ahead. Yes, I am convinced that life continues beyond the grave. I'll share my many reasons for this as we continue on our search for understanding together. But I certainly do not believe that there are many paths to God, or that any religion will get you to heaven if you practice it sincerely. It may be politically incorrect to say, your religion is just as good as mine, or what you believe is true for you and what I believe is true for me. But we're not after political correctness here. We are after truth. My goal in writing this book is to help you find the truth as revealed in the Bible. I believe the Bible is our textbook for life and death. The Scriptures, both the Old and New Testaments, reveal what exists beyond this life and what we must believe and do to arrive at the proper destination. And the truth, according to what the Bible teaches, is that there is a very narrow road that leads to heaven. But more on that later. Is truth absolute? One of my favorite writers, the late theologian and philosopher Francis Schaeffer, had quite a bit to say on the importance of true truth, or absolute truth versus subjective truth, the notion that truth changes depending on the perspective and situation. In powerful works like The God Who Is There Escaped from Reason, How Shall We Then Live, and Whatever Happened to the Human Race, Schaeffer showed clearly the negative impact that comes from rejecting the absolutes of God's Word. If there are no absolutes by which to judge society, then society is absolute, Schaeffer wrote. And if society is absolute, then whatever society dreams as proper is proper. As an example, let's take the case of Nazi Germany. The Nazis believed and taught that it is necessary to rid the world of the Jews and the mentally and physically ill in order to build an Aryan super race. Did this belief make it true or right? Of course not. Yet no end of atrocities is possible if we say there is no such thing as absolute truth. I know this is an extreme example, but it is a harsh illustration of where subjective truth can lead in a world void of absolutes. Schaeffer once said that in our age, the only absolute allowed is the absolute insistence that there is no absolute. Schaeffer died 30 years ago, and I believe what he predicted has already come to pass. Today, one of the biggest faux pas anyone can commit is to appear to be intolerant of another's point of view. If I say the Muslim religion is intolerant of the infidel or that the Quran teaches hate, then I'm considered to be a bigot. If someone believes that he can get to heaven by dancing naked in his garden every night at midnight, I'm supposed to smile and say, well, everyone has their own truth. If I believe in the existence of hell, then I'm being narrow and judgmental. But what if something really is true? Does my denial of that fact make it any less so? I may reject the truth that there is an unseen force called gravity, but if I jump out the window of a 10-story building, I will fall to my death regardless what I believed would or would not happen. In our case, if the Bible tells us that hell exists, but I say it doesn't, does my truth have equal value with biblical truth? If we both see a red truck being driven down the street, but I tell you, there goes a blue truck, does that make it any less red? Francis Schaeffer believed that the loss of the concept of absolute truth had caused Westerners to abandon reason. This in turn has led to an increasing fascination with existential philosophy, drugs, and Eastern religion. Schaeffer believed, as I have also come to believe, that the Bible provides us with absolute truth and the standard by which all else must be measured. We may not like some of the things we read in the book, but that won't make them any less so. Like you, I'm not at all comfortable with the concept of hell. I don't want to think of anyone suffering for eternity, but there is absolutely nothing I can do to make it any less true. Why this book is unique. What makes this book different from other books on this subject? Several things. One, as a Messianic rabbi, I have a perspective on Judaism and Christianity as well as the scriptures that differs from those raised in one faith or the other. I have involvement in both. So this book looks at both religions' view of the afterlife historically, as well as digs into the nuances between the two testaments on this important topic. Let me take a moment to explain what I mean when I refer to myself as a Messianic rabbi. As I explained in my book, A Rabbi Looks at Jesus of Nazareth, if you're Jewish and you ask your rabbi about me, he or she will probably tell you that I am not a rabbi. Why? Because rabbi in the Jewish world indicates someone who has studied at a recognized Jewish institution and has been ordained by a mainstream recognized Jewish body. Although I do not meet this particular criteria, I am ordained and have served in the ministry for more than 30 years. I am also credentialed by one of two recognized national Messianic Jewish organizations and have an extensive background in theology that would meet the educational criteria of a Jewish rabbi. 2. As host of the television program Jewish Voice with Jonathan Bernis, I researched and personally interviewed at least a dozen people who claim to have had glimpses of the afterlife. They are among more than 18 million Americans who have had near-death experiences, NDEs. Every one of the people I interviewed had a fascinating story to tell. Without exception, their lives were changed forever by what they experienced. I will share 6 of the most compelling stories with you. 3. As a Jewish believer in Jesus, I have spent the past 34 years of my life sharing with people my personal experiences and what I have learned about the reality of God in the afterlife. I was a college student when I had a supernatural encounter that completely transformed my life. This experience and what I learned in the months that followed changed my goals for the future, my purpose in life, my desires, my relationships with my friends and family, literally everything, including and most importantly, my worldview. As a Jew who has come to accept both that the Bible is true and that Jesus, Yeshua, is the Jewish Messiah foretold in the Torah and prophets, I have a unique perspective on this topic. Both the Old and New Testaments have a great deal to say about what happens to the soul after death. Together, we'll take a very close look at these scriptures. We'll also explore the Mishnah and other sections of the Talmud. We'll discuss the mysticism of the Kabbalah. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll even take a brief look at what different cultures and religions have to say about life after death, and consider what some ancient civilizations have believed. But not everything can be learned through the study of ancient civilizations or scholarly books, even if one of those books is the Bible. In the end, this is a faith proposition. I believe that when presented with all the evidence, the conclusions are clear. My challenge to you as you read, decide what you believe and act on it in this life to determine your eternity. Please, consider what you read carefully with an open heart and mind. Your eternity may be hanging in the balance.